Now, I love anything having to do with history. How about you? You know, one of my favorite times, it's the Middle Ages. You know, knights, King Arthur, Camelot, and how about this? The knight's horses. You know where I'm going? In today's episode, Kathleen Walker-Meikle joins me. She's a world-renowned medieval historian. Now, her expertise extends to how animals were embedded in everyday life during the Middle Ages. And let me tell you, this one is right up my alley, and I am now her biggest fan. And guess what? I think you're going to be her biggest fan too. She's just this wealth of really, really cool knowledge. She's even given me a new term. Now, as you know, I always talk about trivia, but her new term for me, it's pub facts. Now, I just love it, and I'm going to use it all the time. So here's some, wait for it, pub facts. Did you know it's very common for animals to live in your house back then? Now, I'm not just talking about dogs and cats. I'm talking all sorts of animals. Now, I'm sure you've heard of the Zodiac Man, but have you heard of, get it, the Zodiac horse? Yes, the Zodiac horse. Now, back in those times, it was usually the farriers that treated the animals. So these medieval veterinarians believed that certain signs were favorable for certain treatments. So get ready to go way, way back in time, medieval times, and find out all about the animals, how they were treated, and so much more. This episode is definitely special, and it will bring you closer to the time of Camelot.
For real, 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 for real. Got a bunch of furry friends and I love them all the same. I'm an animal lover, veterinarian is the name. Let's share some pet stories from heartwarming to strange, losses and gains, from wacky to insane. For real. You're now tuned in to For Real with your host, Mark Kyle.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the For Real podcast. Today, my guest that's joining me is my new friend and a great historian. Probably my favorite historian now is Dr. Kathleen Walker-Meikle. Kathleen, welcome to the show. I know we're going to be fun. We've had so many chances to talk. This is going to be a fun one.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or wherever anybody might be. And I'm delighted to be here. And I couldn't resist the opportunity to be on any podcast called For Real because animal puns are definitely my thing.
Well, you know, you and I mean, the last time we talked, we could have talked for hours, and I know you're real busy. By the way, everybody's listening, she's an author. She's done all kinds of crazy stuff that I'm really just so impressed with. But let's just talk with you. Let's start, you know, as I told you, and as everybody that listens, I like to get people to get to know you. Let's talk about your journey. I know you're in London right now, but that's not where you started. Let's go where you started and how you got where you are, and this is follow our journey and have fun.
Anyway, so hello everyone. Yes, I'm born in Chile, in actually the central northern part, just at the bottom, just where the Atacama Desert really starts. And so did all my did my schooling and everything in Chile. I then sort of decided, after a sort of brief foray and thinking, should I be sensible and do something like law? I then decided no, being completely stupid and not sensible is the way to go. So I recommend I shouldn't say career advice for all, probably not the best, but yay, give it a go. And I then went on to history. I started out when I did history very interested actually in ancient history, but then decided to do a master's, and at that time thought I was going to do sort of late antique history of the Roman Empire, and got attracted into the Middle Ages, and almost I call it almost the dark side because it is delightfully bonkers in a good way. I spend lots of time fighting on my patch to defend the Middle Ages because there's so many stereotypes which are complete nonsense, from everything from they thought the world was flat, no they didn't, they were very dirty, no they weren't, or they were really horrible to cats. And on that one, no, they aren't. But so I really fell in love with the Middle Ages. and then decided to do more work. And I thought of doing a sort of I was planning on doing a PhD, which I did at University College London, and I was trying to find a sensible subject. So I was thinking perhaps ancient Roman historians and how they thought about natural history and how was this then sort of transmitted and received in the later Middle Ages. And so I was all doing this. And a couple of weeks into my PhD, my supervisor cheerfully just looked up from his typewriter, because he believed in typewriters, and said, "Do you know anything about pets?" And I said, "I have no idea." And he said, "Did they have pets?" And I said, "Well, I don't know." And he said, "Well, go off and find out and come back next week." So this might have been, by the way, a crafty excuse to get rid of me. Perhaps he just wanted he had enough of the meeting. So off I went to the British Library, and all of a sudden I began to sort of look, and it's true that in a lot of printed secondary literature there were no references to pets. But then I began to look at primary materials. This is the words of medieval authors themselves, and there would seem to be tons of them. And I began then I had a quick look then at some medieval manuscripts, and I couldn't stop looking at there were little dogs everywhere, there were cats everywhere, there were people holding squirrels, there were parrots in cages. And so I went back the next week and said, "I'm changing the PhD. Pliny the Elder, sorry, he's getting dumped, and I'm now going to do a PhD on medieval pets." So I did that. There's a book based on that research called Medieval Pets, printed by Boydell and Brewer, available in paperback with some very nice pictures, including some pet badgers that are wearing little silver collars. So there, from pets, I've also expanded, always on the animal theme. So I've looked at animal venoms and snake bite in the Middle Ages. I've looked at pharmacology, so using actually the body parts of animals to cure humans or to use that for magical recipes. And at the moment, I'm very interested in animal disease. So when are animals being sick, and also what today we call zoonotic diseases, which is diseases that can infect both animals and humans and are often transmitted either via the animals to humans or humans to animals, which, by the way, is not unsurprising since often these might they often come from mammals, and since we are mammals, we should not really be shocked that this happens. And so in that way, I began studying that, and initially just looking at what medieval sources had to say about animal disease. And then I rather wonderfully got contacted by a team in Switzerland. Well, actually, they were in Austria at the time, and they sort of asked me and had an online meeting. And their first question to me was, "Can you understand why a squirrel in the Middle Ages might get leprosy?" And that's quite a mad question if you think about it.
Sure.
And the fact is that they were researching both medieval humans, bones, and analyzing the DNA of both human bones and squirrel bones, and were noticing, that both the squirrels and the humans were having, sharing a similar strain of leprosy. And I cheerfully said to them, I said, "Yes." I said, "That's not a stupid question." And they answered, "Why?" And I said, "Because they're mad on squirrels in the period. They're keeping them as pets. They're holding them everywhere. And apart from that, they're all skinning as many squirrels as they can find because they're covering all their clothes. I don't know. We can blame perhaps the Little Ice Age for this, but all the interiors of all their clothes are being lined with thousands of squirrel skins." And so from that, they managed to then get a nice big grant, which then meant that I could be employed on a part-time basis. And so I'm employed 50% at the University of Basel, and I also work at the Science Museum in London, on a lovely job working on research grants. And so that's basically almost my passage to here to then Mark sort of inviting me on to his lovely podcast.
So I got a question for you. How did you end up from Chile to England first? I've got, you know me, I've got a gazillion questions for you already, but how did you end up in England from Chile? And were you speaking English at that time as well?
Yes, I was because fortunately I already could speak English because I spoke English at home because my parents immigrated to Chile, but my father's a New Zealander. And my mother, even though she left at the age of 9, she was born in England. So I had, for which I'm very grateful, British passport, and which meant that when I decided I wanted to pursue postgraduate studies, I decided to move to the UK. So
that makes some sense.
Since then, I've stayed a lot, sort of things around in Europe. Like I've spent some time in Italy, a year in Ireland, and some time in Scotland, and other parts of England. But yes. Just sort of. I know at the moment I'm in the northern hemisphere, even though I actually still can never really get used to it.
The weather.
Well, it does rain a lot. Where I come from in northern in Chile, in the 4th region, we have almost no rain, and if it rains, it's practically a public holiday. Because everybody is just looking at the rain. You even have special food, sopaipillas, that you eat when it rains. So it's very exciting. Despite where I am at the moment in London, it has rained, I think, every day since New Year.
You know, I find I got several things. So I find that for people that are curious, I think almost any person I know that's really curious loves history. Because there's just so much there, right? And if it's a fiction thing, I want to read a historical fiction that's based on fact, but has a story to it. I love stories, so I find that. But I also think it's kind of interesting for you. You're in England, so you're basically a Sherlock Holmes when you're digging into all that stuff too, which is kind of ties into all that too. And then lastly, the other thought I had is I was thinking about it's so interesting. I recently, I have an episode that I guess it's out this week that was on dingoes. And one of the things that they're doing, what she specializes in, is looking at the DNA. And I think the more I talk to people that are experts like yourself and looking into animals, the new DNA technology is really pushing everybody really forward. You're using the DNA for the leprosy and all that kind of stuff and looking at the similarities. It must be so fun for people that are, one, scientists, or two, the researchers, to find out all this new information that you're getting with DNA. It's got to be just jumping everything real fast forward.
Oh, it is fascinating. It means you really have to stay on top of the research, but also you have to familiarize yourself with how other people work, like other scientific disciplines, like how it's a running joke in my Basel team. Whenever we have a meeting, they'll all be talking about lab works, because they've all got fears about contamination. So
right.
They do it all in incredibly sort of special suits, and it'll be, how do we extract the dental pulp from this? And then they'll or else similarly for shotgun sequencing, which is how they sequence the DNA. They need huge amounts of storage space on the servers because they're analyzing millions of fragments.
Right.
And then they'll say, and how much storage space are you using? And then they see, oh, Kathleen's got 500 Word documents. And it's
sounds like me.
And I'll usually pipe in by something saying, and there's some pictures there too. But it's, but I do think it's actually a very exciting time. But it needs to be where you're all working together, I think, is what the best scholarship can be. Because just as when working with scientists, they're not familiar with putting it in a historical context, there are lots of really interesting questions the DNA people can provide, which is not possible to do in the historical record. I mean, in the last sort of almost quarter of the 20th century, there was a big academic fight about what really was the disease that caused the Black Death in the 14th century.
Right.
And because basically, in the late 19th century, plague, with the bacteria, Yersinia pestis, was identified during an entire outbreak in Hong Kong in the late 19th century. And so and the connection between rats being a vector and via the rat fleas to humans was established as this is a possibility. By the way, rats aren't the only animals that can give you plague, as since you live in the US, I know prairie dogs and all kinds of other animals,
Right.
all kinds of other fun animals, rodents are often, and in Central Asia, it's marmots. But there was a lot of controversy late at the end of the 20th century over what was this disease. Was it actually, and lots of scholars looking at the historical records said, I don't really think it was plague, bubonic plague. Maybe it was something else. And so lots of fights. And then in 2011, very excitingly, they did work on a plague cemetery from bodies excavated in Smithfield in London, and there the DNA people, by then DNA research had managed to get advanced enough to identify pathogens, and they could identify from the dental pulp of the skeletons that yes, the people that had been buried there at the exact time all had Yersinia pestis, had plague. And so and now, for example, that question historically has pretty much been put to bed. People do not now argue over the disease. However, you do, still have scholarly arguments about other questions. And there's some things that I said that the different disciplines can answer, and other ones that we can just do it. So, for example, as a historian, I can only my sources, lots of which actually are in very small amounts, and they only exist, they don't, because so much is destroyed over time. So I'm looking at what is the point of view of a person from that time. And so I have to get myself into the mindset. And it's why when I examine animals, I'm very interested into how did they think about animals. What did they, what was the status of animals? How were they valued? How did you buy them? But thinking of it from their point of view.
Well, that's true. I mean, it's kind of like perception's reality, right? At some point, and it's also cultural too. One culture can think something different too, so that's got to be real difficult. And that kind of leads me into here we go again. We've had, for you guys listening, we had a long conversations and we went everywhere with it. It was so much fun for me.
For real, 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 for real.
And we'll be right back.
As a pet lover, did you know your pet can benefit from the incredible healing power of stem cell therapy? Prep Therapy offers a groundbreaking solution taken right from your pet's own blood. Say goodbye to joint pain, arthritis, kidney and liver conditions, and more. They'll experience faster recovery, increased vitality, and extended quality of life without the need for surgery or harmful drugs. Put the wag back in their tail and discover Prep Therapy today at prepvet.com. Save 10% with promo code FurRealPodcast, covered by most pet insurance.
So let's talk a little bit about animals back in the medieval times and the way, how they were perceived. I know that there's some misconceptions. I know you've debunked a lot of that from a standpoint of, I know that the rich had, the hunting dogs and all that, but let's talk a little bit about how animals were back in those times. And what way, actually, before we go there, I want to ask you a question. I'm guessing you probably not speak, but know Latin pretty well.
Yes, and that's just a case of with medieval research, you're looking at the original language, you're looking at material in the original languages, and most of what I look at is in Latin.
Right.
Sometimes it's in other languages like Old French, sort of Castilian, early Middle English. So so you are looking a lot in material at the time. In many ways, actually, I find Latin, because its spelling and stayed quite consistent in the last sort of several hundred years. I actually find it an easier language than all of a sudden getting a vernacular language, because sometimes I will just have something that gets thrown at me, and whether it's sort of Middle High German or Occitan, and you just have to sort of struggle on. So yes, a lot of the material is and often the material is preserved in manuscripts, which are themselves animal skins. So, and I always find that rather charming that I study animals by looking at material that is made up from animals.
That is kind of charming. So I'm going to give you a little trivia of me. I took 1 year of Latin. I can't remember what grade it was, but so here in the States it's A, B, C, D, F, right? I had a D in it. I was so bad at it. Well, also I was just lazy. But anyway, so I know a little bit of Latin, but very little. So let's talk about perceptions of what animals are like. And because we could go so many different places, and I know this is your journey, but I just have questions. So, and for people listening, because it's different the way that they looked at animals than we do today a little bit, but it's different in the same. So I'm just going to shut up now and let you do the talking.
Well, and this is just a caveat to all. I'm specifically talking about sort of animals in medieval Europe.
Sure.
So just in case you're asking, she didn't talk about animals in China or in India.
Right.
Please, please, medieval Europe is that I think almost the starting point is the concept of to think about how they envisaged the world and animals' place in it, and that's very much based on biblical texts. So the 2 pointers there is that the idea that animals are placed on earth for mankind to exploit them and use them. And so officially that means is that humans are on top, animals are below. And the other distinction that they get from the Bible, which if you read lots of chapters in Genesis, you will spot this very quickly, is that they divide animals into the environment which they live in. So there's animals of the land, there's animals of the air, animals of the sea, and what they call crawling animals. And to crawl is reptilia, from where we get the word reptile, but they're not talking about reptiles. They're for crawling animals. They include everything from snakes to possibly sometimes even mice and rats are crawling animals, or animals such as mosquitoes and flies. And so that's almost this rather fourth mysterious category. And so the animals of the earth are often sometimes thought of things like quadrupeds, that's animals with 4 legs, and most of our material is on that. But this means that, for example, animals of the sea, and the water, they'll put crocodiles there along with fish and tortoises and turtles, because they all go to it's almost where they live.
Right.
So that's almost one of their definitions. The other one is that you'll be defining animals that they're there's wild animals, sort of domesticated animals. And this is very important because most of the material, material that you see is about domesticated animals. And this is not surprising because if you are for example, think of your account books. People are going to be listing the animals they are buying, the animals they are selling. They are not going to be listing, my goodness, I saw a fabulous flock of sparrows last week. So there's a lot more references to domestic animals than wild animals. Often with wild animals, if they mention them, it might be because they're doing something which they shouldn't be doing, like eating your sheep, or else it's an idea of the exotic. So they'll be they might talk about animals that live perhaps very far away, and sometimes the information that they will have naturally from animals that are not local might be inaccurate, but things. It's a bit like when you see all the descriptions of elephants, and they might draw elephants with hooves. And there's lots of legends about animals that come from far away that they might just not see, or very rarely, because you might occasionally have an elephant. Like there was an elephant turned up in the mid-13th century in London. It was a present from the King of France, and everyone thought that was rather wonderful. And that was the case that people were seeing an elephant for the first time. And they also, at about the same time, they saw a polar bear in London for the first time, because the Norwegian king sent one as a gift. It used to swim in the Thames, in the river.
Really?
Yes, its keeper used to take it out swimming, and it lived, and the both of them lived in the Tower of London, and you could see them. So it's mostly so a lot of the material is domestic animals, and of the domestic animals, again, there are divisions. So there's livestock. So these are all animal everything from from sheep and chickens and cows. And then you have quite a lot of surviving material on animals that are important to certain segments of society. And because just the way of how material survives, we have a lot more for people who are very wealthy than we have for people who are not. So the two animals that are really associated with aristocratic culture, which is horses and dogs, really dominate the material. Both of these were considered to be very noble. Very noble animals to be to be highly sort of approved of. So there's a lot. So it's a case of almost the two animals that you can talk about a lot are horses and dogs, and then after that they start, because just for economic considerations they'll talk a lot about pigs and or sheep. It's why I began to get interested in looking at sort of almost the ones by passing, so looking for pets. It meant that sometimes in regular sources they were very difficult to find. So it was, for example, it was very uncommon to find people buying pets. I'd look up in economic material to see where are you, so how much is this cat costing you? But there was a lot, for example, I found on people giving pets as gifts, and it's part of gift-giving culture. It's very big at the time, sort of things. As people who read Lord of the Rings, the entire idea of giving presents like rings to your followers was very big. And in the same way, you might give a parrot to somebody, and that would be considered actually it's part of elite culture. But similarly, for example, in economic records, I would find, and this is for aristocratic records, that they were buying accessories for the pets. So they would be buying like little collars for the dogs, or perhaps a cage for the parrots. And that's where I would find the references. It wouldn't be, meanwhile, you wouldn't find them elsewhere. Unlike, for example, references to pigs running amok in cities. Even though there's lots of references to people complaining about dogs running wild in cities. In fact, it's a general theme that people get. An idea that very common to today is that people do not like other people's animals running around on their roads. So lots of complaints of people were letting their animals run wild. But that's actually where I started to find lots of references to cats, and it's why I very much try to defend sort of Middle Ages against sort of gross calumny of being anti-cats, and also not quite a lot of nonsense that's brought in, like just assumed about, for example, from the early modern persecution of witches. In which actually cats are not, by the way, were officially persecuted due to association with witches, even in the early modern period. They are sometimes in the English tradition, which is not the continental tradition. There's the idea of the familiar, where the witch has is given some demons by the devil, and that these can take animal form. But at the time, even when you see early modern witch trials, the familiars can be anything from a mouse to a pet spaniel dog called Jeremy. That's one in the Matthew Hopkins trials. So it's specific. So yes, I very much defend they are not anti-cat, because I found lots of references to pet cats and people keeping cats inside the house. And yes, they're keeping them partly because they're quite useful for getting rid of mice, but there are also people talk about keeping cats for companionship, writing poems about their cats, and so on. So yes.
So why do you think that the cat was associated with? Is there a story behind the cat being associated with witches? Is it just became a thing?
I don't want to say sort of officially, I blame the 19th century, but yes, a lot of sort of 19th century historical works have this idea that everything in the Middle Ages is very primitive, and I think that's the starting idea that that sort of an idea that yes, there's references to cats associated with witches, but sometimes that just might be that
It became a story and it just grew.
And there's all kinds of animals associated with witches, just as there might be discussions about witches transforming into cats. You also see witches transforming themselves into flies or into wolves. So they're not completely, they're not very anti-cat. And also, even if, for example, you might have theologians discussing that cats, they might say a cat is a symbol for heresy, that doesn't mean that people are changing their behavior of how they're treating the animal. It's no more difference that they might say, I don't know, the hedgehog is a symbol for X, or the whale is a theological symbol for Y. That doesn't mean that you're actually changing on your day-to-day life how you're treating an animal. The one thing, however, that I'm envious of people who work a lot on medieval horses, which I've done a bit of work, but not as much as other some people I know, is that firstly, they have a lot more material than I do. And sort of secondly, they have a lot about horse health, which at the moment, for example, in Basel, I'm working a lot on disease in rodents. So looking at everything from squirrels to rats and mice. And there's a lot less material than if I was looking at sick horses.
Right.
Meanwhile, like 99% of the references are if sick horses, and if it's not sick horses, it's sick pigs or sick cows. But almost and similarly for dogs, you get it in sort of hunting manuals because aristocratic men are hunting with dogs. There you get ideas about treatment for dogs who are sick, or what happens if your dog has a canker in his paw, and so on. But I get almost nothing, for example, even though I have lots of references to people keeping caged birds. I have no references to what happens if the bird is sick or you're healing it. Meanwhile, there is material about taking care of your falcons if you're doing falconry, so if you're hunting them.
Well, I think it's curious. One is that animals, there was a status symbol. So you had certain animals you had more status. Obviously, the horse was a big status symbol for a variety of reasons. Obviously, if you're a knight, that was your most expensive asset, but also people owning horses for livelihood too. So, but a lot of them slept inside the house, which I thought is kind of fascinating. It reminds me of the Maasai. All their animals sleep inside their house. So,
well, it also would depend it would depend. But yes, and often very small cottages, it might be just divided, and you'd have. You wouldn't be. They wouldn't be sleeping next to you on the bed or sort of things. But it's a case that if you just had a one-bedroom dwelling, you might be bringing your animals in,
right.
And there'd be a division, and that you can still see that, for example, in Switzerland to this day.
Really?
In farmhouses, you can see where the animals sometimes are just the barn is sometimes just actually underneath,
right.
Like where you would have the basement in the US, the barn that might be the barn, and that's where the animals are still kept. So I think it's also they were, however, concerned, for example, about animal wastes. This is again my other bugbear, which is they were filthy. Middle Ages is filthy, is that they actually are very concerned about ideas of smell, which people do not like the idea that you're cleaning up animal waste, you're getting rid of it as quickly as possible. There's lots of complaints of, for example, of what happens when your neighbor dumps their animal waste on your property, and people sort of take them to court, or sort of city authorities are sort of issuing proclamations of you shouldn't do this, or we will give fines to people who do this. So it's the idea that people do not do not want sort of animal waste, or human waste for that matter, really around them, and they would go and try to make sure that it was cleaned up as soon as possible.
Well, when I was doing my homework, I was reading it. It reminded me because, like I mentioned, I've spent a lot of time in Africa, and of course, I've been in some Maasai villages. And if you go inside one of their houses, which is kind of a dung house, anyways, but they have a separate room that they sleep at night with, but the goats have their own little area. A lot of the goats, they're all sleeping inside the house, and that's really to protect them more than anything else because it's an asset and that's livelihood at the end of the day.
Oh, yes, no. Well, because you always want to take care of your animals. It's why I was quite sort of, they are an economic asset. So you do not want to just make sure. It's true that sometimes some of the remedies they might do to them, you might think that's a bit nasty or a bit cruel. For example, I've seen sections of where, for example, sheep suffering from skin disorders, they might go and put, for example, some sulfur on the skin, and you think that must have been pretty sort of quite unpleasant for the sheep in question. But it's the idea of they are trying to treat the animal. It's not something I'd recommend doing today, but still, that they are it's entire ideas of what you do, what are you trying to do. And similarly, I've one of my favorite things is that there's a very long tradition. This comes from ancient Rome, where if somebody is suffering from rabies, they should go swimming in seawater. I've seen this from about the 1st century AD. And by the way, this is not any good because if you do have rabies, by the time you get the symptoms, it's 100% death.
Right.
But anyway, and so there's a tradition, a lot that some medieval authors talk about, and where you take your dogs out sea bathing as a prophylactic against rabies. And I have a Norman sort of surgeon who's working in Paris in the early 14th century, and he's cheerfully saying that, where I come from in Normandy, it's just common, you just see on the beach, everybody's taking their dogs out for a walk and putting them into the sea because that means that they'll stay nice and healthy and they won't get rabies. So again, it's just because that technically doesn't work and is inaccurate, they would do it. And similarly, for example, when animals were sick, and this is particularly for horses and dogs, which, as we mentioned, are often quite animals of the elite. You might sort of, apart from trying to get heal them with sort of more conventional remedies, they sometimes, for example, would appeal to saints, and so you might even take your dog or your horse on a pilgrimage to cure what was wrong with them. So there's in Exeter in southwest England, in the cathedral, they have found these little wax models of horses' hooves and horses' heads, and these were made by people who were coming in pilgrimage to the cathedral, and they would go and leave at the saint's shrine. They would leave a little model of the horse's body part that they wanted the saint to cure. So if it had a problem, for example, with its leg, they would go and leave a little hoof and hope that would cure them. And similarly, for example, there's a Saint Hubert, whose shrine is in the Ardennes, which is modern-day Belgium, who's very good who was very good for calling against rabies. And so just before the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, against Henry V of England and the French, which the English win hugely thanks to longbows and and mud, is that there one of the French princes, Charles Duc d'Orléans, he sends just before the battle all his dogs on an entire pilgrimage. And just think of the logistics. This is a time of where you're having to put your dogs on carts. This might take several weeks. All the way from his estates in France, sends them up to sort of what is now modern-day Belgium, up to the Ardennes, because one of them he thinks is sick with rabies. It wouldn't have rabies, well, they would all be dead, but still. Yeah. He does this, and he sends his entire pack of hunting dogs, so about 20 dogs, are sent off, all in a little pilgrimage by themselves, with some keepers, to get the saint to go and help them.
Get a blessing.
I don't know, by the way, what happened afterwards to these dogs, because Charles de Orleans was captured by the English and spent about the next 40 years as a prisoner. So I have no idea what happened to the dogs, sort of thing.
They became Belgian monks and made beer. That's what they did.
That could always be an idea, because monks actually, monks and nuns are very fond of pets, and that actually. When I told you about how I started it, it was the first written source that I noticed that was going on about pets.
Saint Francis.
Was basically somebody complaining about nuns keeping pets, and a bishop of Lincoln. And the moment I saw that, it was like, why is he complaining? And on the general view, when people make a lot of complaints, it's a bit like when somebody's complaining. If, for example, a city authority is having to issue a lot of regulations and fines, it usually means a lot of people are doing that. And similarly, if somebody is always making complaints, I'd say that's pretty standard practice. And so then I began to collect, and I saw it was actually completely normal that yes, lots of nuns and monks were keeping pets. And you even see this in Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, where the prioress, one of his characters, she is specifically described as she comes with 2 little dogs. And it's a reflection on her character, because she's rather wealthy and quite spoilt, is that the 2 little dogs, Geoffrey Chaucer says, is that she only feeds them meat and white bread, which is incredibly extravagant food if you think about it. Like, this is luxury food, and to her, and just as people today go on about people keeping sort of like pets in their designer handbags and spending a fortune on them, this is a woman who in Chaucer's poem in the late 14th century is feeding her dogs incredibly elite, expensive food, which is white bread and meat, quite cheerfully.
For real, 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 for real.
And we'll be right back.
As a pet lover, did you know your pet can benefit from the incredible healing power of stem cell therapy? Prep Therapy offers a groundbreaking solution taken right from your pet's own blood. Say goodbye to joint pain, arthritis, kidney and liver conditions, and more. They'll experience faster recovery, increased vitality, and extended quality of life without the need for surgery or harmful drugs. Put the wag back in their tail and discover Prep Therapy today at prepvet.com. Save 10% with promo code FurRealPodcast, covered by most pet insurance.
I read something, too, when I was doing my homework, that they would prosecute and excommunicate animals back in the day, too, if they were, for whatever reason. Is that true?
Yes. It's quite rare, but it's 2 types of processes. One is a sort of a civil process, which is against an individual animal. So let's say that a pig gets loose in the city and goes around running, destroying things, and destroys lots of people's property, and perhaps does something really sort of a tragedy happens, like it runs into a child, injures or kills the child. You then have to work out, who is at fault? Is it the pig's owner, or is it the pig? And you might actually put the pig itself on trial. And there's, apart from individual processes, you also have, as you mentioned, excommunication, and these are processes against an entire, almost genre of animals. So, and this is where you'd have a priest would go and give out an anathema to, for example, and this is usually done to vermin. So, for example, suppose if you had tons of caterpillars that were destroying all of your fields around the village, then you would try to organize for the priest, and he would say an anathema, which usually went along the lines of, be gone, caterpillars, in the name of, name of the Virgin Mary, name of Jesus, etc., etc. I want all you caterpillars, you've got, you better leave ASAP. So that's regularly done, and it's because, a bit like how I mentioned the taking your animal to the shrine of a saint, you're doing multiple things at the same time. So you might be trying to sort of destroy the caterpillars by other methods, but then you'd also sort of hedge your bets, so to say, and get a nice religious anathema onto. And this is actually quite understandable, particularly with vermin. If you have, for example, huge amounts of field mice invading your crops, you want to do something about it. How do you do it? This would be seen as one of the ways. So yes, there is a famous court case in early 16th century Auton in France, in the Bordeaux region, in which a lot of rats get taken to court, and they have completely their own, like a young lawyer sort of defends them and has all kinds of incredibly good arguments. My favorite being, which is when the prosecutor says that the rats are in contempt of court because they haven't turned up to the proceedings.
Oh my gosh.
And he argued that no, the rats are haven't turned up because they're scared of your cat man, which I find delightful.
That's
But I always say, particularly because I've got a keen interest in medieval science, is that these people are very clever, they're very sophisticated, they're very learned, and it all makes logic. It does make, if you think about it, it makes perfect sense. Just because it's not something we do it doesn't mean that it's foolish. It's just that in the way that they were conceiving of how the world worked, that made sense. It's the same way that, completely, it makes perfect sense to think that the world, that the Earth is at the center of the universe, and that all the other planets and the sun rotate against the Earth. If you do, you can do completely sort of mathematical calculations of the movements of the other planets, and you can fit everything in perfectly. You can do that very advanced. Just because that's not true doesn't mean that doesn't mean that the theory behind it isn't perfectly solid,
right.
and quite sort of completely sort of intellectually strong.
That comes back to your perception as reality, right? You've decided this is what it is, and we're going to do this. I want, and this is a good segue into. By the way, I was thinking, how I was talking about you're the chef serving the meal. I think we're doing a buffet because there's so many. We could stay on everything, but I was thinking about. Remember when you sent me the astrological chart with the horse? Can you talk about that and how that reflects to how they were treating people, animals and people for medicine, because it's all tied into that. So it's fascinating to me. Well,
it's the idea that how are they conceiving of animal bodies and human bodies is that they actually think of them, that they're working really the same. So, for example, a human body, they think, is that inside your body there's a mixture of 4 different liquids, which they call, there's blood, there's phlegm, there's black bile and yellow bile, and they think that these all, and this comes from, by the way, sort of Greek and Roman medicine, and they think that all of these 4 liquids inside your body are all interacting in different ways, and that if you have more than one, you might have a certain condition. If you have, for example, if you what they think is very depressed and ill, you might have a lot of black bile, which is where we get the sort of the word, where we get the word melancholic, that is to have black bile. So, and similarly, they might decide that if you had too much of the yellow bile, you were choleric. And so often diseases, even though actually they actually do have ideas of infection, particularly, by the way, with animals, because they worked out that animals could infect other animals, and you see there's a lot actually in horse medicine, because where you might have to remove a sick horse from other horses because you're afraid of it giving the other ones diseases. But there was also an idea that diseases would just spontaneously generate in your body because of the imbalance of humors. And so just as humans have these 4 these 4 substances inside them, so do animals. And so, for example, a horse is white is because he's got more phlegm in him, is dominating. A horse, for example, a black horse has more black bile. Meanwhile, the perfect chestnut horse is because he's got more yellow bile, and for them the perfect horse is a bay horse because he's the dominant element there is blood, and so he's a sanguine, and to be sanguine, to have blood as your dominant one was seen as the best. So just as it worked, so the idea that the animal body was seen as working the same as humans' bodies, and so the famous, what we think of as the zodiac man, which is a sort of figure of a human with all the different sort of zodiacs on each different body part. So, for example, you might have so you have Aries at the head, you've got Pisces at the feet, you've got Scorpio, Scorpio at the genitals. You have all different zodiac houses rule over different parts of the body. And this would mean that certain medical operations, such as surgery, or perhaps even taking some medicines, you wouldn't do when that zodiac, like that constellation, was was in what that was in that particular phase. So, for example, depending on depending on whether you wanted to do surgery, you have to check what constellation, what is currently the zodiac constellation dominating at the moment, because you can't do anything if it's if it's that one. But just like this, they worked it out the same for animals. So just as you wouldn't operate on a person's feet if the moon was in Pisces, you wouldn't operate on a horse's hooves if the moon is in Pisces, because it's just it's transposed and paralleled. And similarly, for example, when they talk a lot about disease, they would talk about, for example, leprosy in horses. And by this, they're not specifically meaning what we think of as leprosy, which today is Hansen's disease. Instead, for them, they are thinking about it's a debilitating skin condition is all they're thinking of, and a serious one. And so therefore, if it's a serious debilitating skin condition in humans, it's therefore is one the same in horses. And so a lot of it is they are transposing. There are some diseases which it seems that they thought that only horses could get, but on the whole, it's their bodies work the same. And similarly, for example, with rabies that I mentioned before, that there it was understood that you could get rabies from dogs, and only from dogs, which is not true. You can actually get rabies, all mammals can get it, but they thought it was only from dogs because they thought that dogs themselves were very
rabid dog.
They think that dogs are very melancholic. That is, dogs have a lot of black bile. Getting back to animals and humans having the same bodily work, and that dogs would get almost sad and more sad and then start attacking you. And I have a 14th century Italian writer who specifically says you shouldn't shout at your dog and you shouldn't kick him, because this would make him sadder. And the sadder your dog gets, the more melancholic he gets, and he might become rabid. The author also said you shouldn't let them sleep by the fire and then kick them outside into the cold, because this will affect all of their internal sort of properties and make them sick. So this is again getting back to the point of this isn't true, but logically, actually, if you're working under humoral theory, it's actually it's perfectly sensible. It's yes, if that's how you theorized how the body works, it makes perfect sense that you do not want to make somebody to have an excess of black bile and then sort of become, in this case, rabid. And it worked similarly so that, for example, when humans get rabid, they got all of the symptoms, medieval symptoms, are very much dog-like, that you start sort of apart from the famous one of sort of like, sort of hydrophobia, of being feared of water, but the idea that they talk about sort of humans barking, from where we get the term to be barking mad, is from that idea that you become all very dog-like. Meanwhile, the dogs stop being very dog-like, and that they get nasty to their masters, and which is what dogs shouldn't do. I found a lovely reference in a early 20th century vet who was talking about rabies, an English vet in the early 20th century, and he was saying about how terrible the disease was, because he says it makes our beloved companion turn into a cobra. And I thought I very much liked it because it was very much on this following a medieval tradition of the all of a sudden the animal becoming treacherous, and it has betrayed what it should be, which is good and nice to us, and then all of a sudden being nasty.
Well, what's funny is you're barking mad. There's one of my pub facts for you. We're right online again with the pub facts. Barking mad. Let's talk about. One of the things I'm curious about, when you start seeing this stuff, you see all these way back when they were really doing veterinary, taking care of the animals. Does it go? I mean, there's some really early ones, but it seems to me the more I read it, kind of the Roman times, is that when really you started seeing veterinary kind of being there, or was that prior to that?
It's a case also on what we have surviving in sources. It's true that most we've got a few references in ancient Greek texts, but by Roman times we actually have specific texts dedicated to horse care. We've got quite a lot that survived from sort of the Byzantine Empire. And these are texts just about how to take care of horses, and they would be written by professionals who want to go, who take care of horses. And actually, one of the reasons why they get written, horse care treatises, is that they're not just written as almost an aide-memoire for you and other fellow sort of horse practitioners. They're also written as a way of social status. That if you are a horse care practitioner, you want to say that you're not just a mere sort of labourer. It's not like somebody taking care of the stable. Yeah. You actually want to say that you almost have equivalent. You have a sort of highly valued status, and because horses are so valuable, their care was seen as something as very important. It's where we still get the word farriers, who would take care, who would not just shoe horses, but they're also taking care of horses.
So that's a perfect thing, because there's a farrier. Then afterwards they're called. I got to look at my notes now, because I wanted to ask you about this. The marshals. What's the difference between a farrier? Because the farriers were the ones who are taking care of the animals, but then there's a different level that's called a marshal. What is that?
Yes, A marshal is somebody who officially is somebody who takes care of the horses, but actually it was a very very impressive title. So, for example, at a royal court, the marshal is one of the highest sort of courtiers. It's because horses are so important. The person who's taking care of the king's horses would be a very high status, a sort of noble, and they would not only take care of the horse, the horses. They'd make sure that they were the king had enough horses, that they sort of stayed healthy, gifts of horses, and of course at this level, let's just say, the marshal is not mucking up the stables, but they are taking care of the horses. And you can still see this elite level in sort of the title of the premier sort of aristocrat in England is the Duke of Norfolk. And his other title is that he has the title of Earl Marshal, which means he's sort of premier earl, but he's also the marshal. It's he is and as marshal, he actually today doesn't take care of horses, but he does, by the way, do everything, such as he's head of the College of Arms, and he also runs any coronations and funerals. So he has still to this day still being called a marshal.
It's kind of like a parade, the Grand Marshal and all that. I've never really thought about that, so it's probably just carried through all those years.
Yes, because that's the reason. A marshal is a sort of high status person.
Yeah.
But yes, it's somebody who is organizing is organizing part of the household, the royal household. So yes, so marshals, yes, farriers would do, but a farrier was something a bit more than a blacksmith. They would they wouldn't just take care of and they're doing more than just taking care of the horse's hooves. They would also be taking care of the horses if they were sick or ill, and so on. The slightly terrifying thing is that in armies that still sometimes have cavalry, you'll often see the farriers will come out with what looks like, even still today, it's symbolic, but they'll come out with an axe, with a weapon that looks like an axe on one side and a sort of almost like a giant sharp spear on the other. And that's to do with, after a battle, the farriers are then sent onto the battlefield, and with the sharp, spiky end, they go around things like they go around getting the coup de grace, killing all the horses that cannot be treated. So they will go around killing the horses, and the axe is actually sort of, I shouldn't say slightly amusing, because I'm talking about dead horses, but it's the axe was instituted. Actually, this is actually not. I don't know if this is medieval. This might actually be a sort of slightly more modern. It's instituted because it's so that they chop off the horse's hooves and collect them to find out how many horses have died on the battlefield. And the problem, and that's because so many people were claiming that their horse had died on the battlefield, which they hadn't, then asking for another horse and selling the horse that they already that they had because it was perfectly healthy. So it's all for accountancy. Getting back to my point from the start of, you find a lot of this thanks to people being very diligent accountants, is yes, for accountancy reasons.
Yeah.
Is that's why you have to go. They have the axe because they have to go around counting the horse's hooves to make sure that nobody is trying to cheat the army of claim that they have lost their horse when they clearly haven't.
And then they went to the petting zoo. That's a side joke for everybody that's listening. But anyways, we're going to have to do this again because I know you're busy and we're already up in an hour. And there's so many other questions. I actually want to get into the study you're doing now with the squirrels and the leprosy and all that, but there's just not enough time. I think we need, I told you you're my new best friend and my favorite historian. We're going to have to do this again, but I know you're up on a schedule and I don't want to take too much time, but is there anything else that you'd like to talk about as we are coming towards the end of this thing that we didn't get to that you think would be cool?
I think just I'd like listeners to understand that there's there was so much out there on on animals' Middle Ages, and partly some of it is familiar, some of it is very unfamiliar. I think what attracted me initially is the familiar. I would start finding long poems in which people are writing very sad poems about the death of their parrots or their pet puppies, and I thought at the time the emotions were they were very familiar. They were sort of this is so dreadful. I can't believe this has happened. I'm never going to recover. And I think that, as much as yes, the past is a different country, they do things differently. and there are things that are incredibly alien and strange, but then there's also, I always found quite charming that with animals, there could be there was often a link, and I discover things almost every day that I'm intrigued. I mean, I know what just final fact on the red squirrels is I talked to somebody in red squirrel conservation. And by the way, just for reference, this is because the European red squirrel is slightly smaller and fluffier than the American grey squirrel.
Grey squirrel, yeah.
Even though in England, actually, they now have they're mostly American grey squirrels, but that's another story. And I talked to them, and I was saying that they're very popular pets in the Middle Ages, and he said to me, well, that's ridiculous. He said they're completely unpleasant, nasty, bitey little animals. I can't see how anyone could have one. And I said, are you sure? And he said, no. He said, I work with squirrel conservation. They're always sort of biting or attacking me. How could you possibly? And I was saying, but no, I've got references to them being on people's shoulders. Sure. And carrying them around and taking them for little walks on leashes, because they used to take their squirrels for walks on leashes. And then I found a source which said that they used to take the squirrels when they were babies from their mothers, from the wild. And this might then explain how they managed to tame, because they're not domesticated, but they're tamed. How they managed to tame these wild animals, and it's quite delightful. I even found references to the squirrel hutches, or a bit like sort of hamster wheels that have little wheels for your squirrels to play on.
Yeah, kind of like the guinea pigs or a hamster.
I know, well, guinea pigs are fun. Just if you want a final note on guinea pigs is that because they're domesticated several thousand years ago in the Andes, and there they're kept as as a food source.
Really?
But when they're imported, when they're taken across the Atlantic into Europe, they are never ever farmed ever as food in Europe. Instead, they incredibly quickly become pets. And so, less than 100 years after Columbus, people are keeping, or very widely in Europe, they're keeping pet guinea pigs.
So it went from South America to Europe, and then over to the U.S. because now everybody's got guinea pigs, and kids do.
I know, but they're lovely animals.
Yeah, my kids had them. As a matter of fact, I'll send you a picture of two guinea pigs on either ear of mine that I did something on there, but I'll send it to you. I had my kids there. My daughter thought it was the funniest thing she ever saw. Pretty funny.
Well, yes, they always remind me a bit of the Tribbles in Star Trek.
Yeah.
Because they make the same noises. But yes, they are delightful. But I would be delighted to come back and talk again, Mark. And just throw me any subjects you want. Like perhaps we could even next time talk about exotic animals like lions or crocodiles in the Middle Ages.
That would be great. So we're going to finish now. Before we finish, for people, and by the way, everybody listening, I say this all the time. The stuff we're going to say now is going to be in the description. If people, I know you have your book, Medieval Pets, but what other things where people can find you? Is there social media? What if people are trying to find more information there? Where should they go and what should they do? Can you for the audience?
I do have some other popular books that might be helpful. I've got one book. I've got two books which I shouldn't say I highly recommend, but I highly recommend. One's called Cats in Medieval Manuscripts, and the other one's called Dogs in Medieval Manuscripts. And even though that's their title, they don't just have images of cats and dogs in manuscripts, which they do. I published these books with the British Library as that on each page there's information about, there might be a story about sort of medieval cats, or perhaps cats associated with a saint. And similarly with the dogs, there's a reference to sort of dogs in all different types of cultural and social contexts. So those are quite sweet little books, and I highly recommend those. And I also have another series of books from Bloomsbury, which is there's Cats of Historical Distinction, Dogs of Historical Distinction, and Horses of Historical Distinction. So those are extra little books. In which I do keep saying to myself that I do need to start a nice jolly website and start blogging some things. I keep saying to myself. So
yeah, well, it's not that you're not busy at all. Not at all.
I know sort of things, but there is just there is so much stuff, and particularly, for example, with manuscripts, now that more material is getting digitized, you're getting a lot more. Like, one of the most delightful things about pets and the digitization of manuscripts is you're starting, because they're digitizing entire manuscripts, so page by page, and then we're starting to find how many pages have animal paw prints on them.
Oh, that's cool.
And it's something that in the past would be almost impossible to find out, because nobody in a catalogue is going to say, on folio 26 verso, there was a cat paw print. Like, why would you? But instead, now that it's digitized, you can see, and there's some wonderful ones where you can see almost like the animal's been scrabbling, it's been fighting, it's been pushed off, it's jumped on with muddy paws.
That's lovely. I love that.
So yes, so the case of they are everywhere. But yes, no, please do invite me on. I'd be delighted to come.
Yeah, we'll do that. And everybody listen again. I'll have the links to all those things there. So we're at the last thing now where I tell the silly animal joke. And I set everybody up with this, is that I'm always looking for other people to come on, kids, grandparents. If you want to be on the show, your grandkids, nieces, nephews, your kids, or whatever, if you email me at mkyleforrealpodcast.com, I'd love to have you on. It's really fun to have other people on to tell these silly jokes, because we know my jokes are so bad, but I'm sure yours will be better. But anyway, here's the joke of the day. So my joke to you is, and I forewarn you, they're really bad. What do you call a knight's favorite horse?
Tell me.
Sir Gallop a lot.
That is very sweet.
I told you it was bad. Anyway, Kathleen, thanks so much for being on. I can't wait to have you on again. This has been a pleasure for me, and I really do appreciate you being on.
No, it's been great fun. Thank you so much. And I will come back, because, as I say, you can't just stop the facts. I mean, I can talk for about an hour just on names that they gave their animals. So if you, on the Sir Galop-a-Lot, we could have an entire thing about what are they calling their horses or their dogs or their parrots.
Well, you may be a regular guest then, because you may have just opened Pandora's box here. But again, I really do appreciate it. And you are going to be on, and we'll talk about that when we get off. But for everybody else that's out there listening, really, thanks so much for listening. Keep following, pass the word on, because with you guys, it's helped me get more people on the show. If you've got ideas for the show, again, email me and we'll do that. But really, truly, thanks so much for listening, everybody, from the bottom of my heart, for real.
That concludes this episode of For Real with your host, Mark Kyle. For previous and future episodes of For Real, listen via all major podcast streaming sites.